They said my husband's funeral would be peaceful, a time to mourn and gather. But instead, I heard words so cold and cruel that my bones shook. Now only one left. My daughter-in-law, standing beside his coffin, speaking as if I were invisible. Today, I'm going to tell you something I never thought I would share. And if for even a second this feels familiar, I only ask that you like this video and subscribe. It will help me keep opening my heart. Every morning in my tiny New York apartment on the Upper West Side, I wake to the same hollow silence. The faded wallpaper peels like the memories I try to hold on to. The smell of stale coffee and old papers fills the air. I make my bed mechanically, the threadbare quilt barely warm, and I watch the gray city outside through windows that haven't been properly cleaned in months. Noise and life keep moving on without me, 23 floors below. But that Tuesday morning in March, when the phone call came that he was gone, I expected my family to rally around me. Instead, I was left shivering in a crowd that turned hostile. My name had been accidentally left off some of the funeral arrangements. My own daughter-in-law, Sandra, the woman who had shared Thanksgiving dinners at our table for 15 years, stood there at the viewing, cold and distant, murmuring those words that cut deeper than any knife could ever reach. I still remember every detail from that funeral home on Amsterdam Avenue. The sickly sweet scent of white lilies mixed with the smell of wet wool coats. My trembling hands adjusting the collar of his navy suit one last time. My breath catching on a sob that never fully escaped my throat. That moment when Sandra leaned over the coffin and whispered just loud enough for me to hear. Now, only one left. Shattered something inside me that I didn't even know was still whole. I touched the faded photograph on my dresser later that night. Harold smiling at me from our honeymoon in Niagara Falls, when we were young and hopeful and believed love could conquer anything. I wondered then, staring at that picture through tears, who am I now without him? Who am I to them? The answer came faster than I expected. For 47 years, Harold and I built something together. We started with nothing but hope and 2 suitcases in a Brooklyn studio apartment that barely had enough room for our dreams. We saved every penny, worked double shifts, invested carefully in stocks when the market was still something regular people could understand. We watched our modest investments grow into something substantial over the decades. Not millions, but enough. Enough for Harold to retire at 62. Enough for us to move to Manhattan. Enough to help our children when they needed it. And help them I did. For decades, I gave everything to my family. I sacrificed my nursing career when Michael was born. Then again when David came along 2 years later. I cleaned other people's houses on weekends so my boys could go to college without student loans. I cooked every meal with love, despite the arthritis that made my joints ache by evening. I forgave broken promises and overlooked cold shoulders, because family meant everything to me. Everything. The phone calls always came at inconvenient times. "Mom, can you wire me some money? Rent is due and I'm between projects." That was Michael, my oldest, calling from his apartment in Brooklyn. Sandra would be in the background, her voice sharp and impatient. "Sure, honey, I'll manage," I would say. And I did, again and again. 500 here, 1,000 there. We helped them with the down payment on their house in Queens. We paid for Sandra's mother's medical bills when her insurance wouldn't cover everything. Harold, who had once been my fierce protector, grew quieter toward me in those final years. His silence carried an unspoken sadness I couldn't name and couldn't mend. At Christmas dinners filled with forced smiles around their dining room table, Sandra's sharp glances would skim past me as if I were a piece of furniture. Cold silences sat between us like unwelcome guests. "You really think she needs that money right now?" I overheard Michael whisper to Sandra one afternoon when they thought I was napping on their couch. The way he said she instead of mom made my stomach turn. I started to doubt everything. Was I being used? Had I become nothing more than a financial safety net while I slowly faded into the background of my own family? David, my younger son, visited less and less. When he did come by, he seemed nervous, distracted. "How's the portfolio doing, Mom?" he would ask, but he never asked how I was doing. His wife Jennifer was polite but distant. Their children, my grandchildren, barely knew me anymore. When had I become a stranger in my own family? The signs had been there for months. maybe years. Birthdays passing with perfunctory phone calls that lasted exactly long enough to ease their conscience. A winter cough that lasted 6 weeks, but no one came to check on me after Harold was gone. I remember the ache in my chest more than the pills the doctor prescribed. The doctor I had to call myself, because no one else seemed to notice I was disappearing. One humid Thursday afternoon in June, while cleaning out Harold's study, I found something that changed everything. Hidden behind old tax documents was a tablet Harold had used for his investments. I almost threw it away, but something made me turn it on. The battery was nearly dead, but there was enough power to show me his recent emails. What I found made my blood run cold. There were messages between Sandra and Michael, dozens of them. Messages about Harold's declining health. Messages about me. Messages that spoke of removing obstacles and accelerating the timeline. They discussed his investment accounts like they were discussing the weather. They talked about me like I was an inconvenience to be managed. "The old witch is getting suspicious," Sandra had written just 2 weeks before Harold died. "We need to move faster on the Bitcoin transfers before she figures out what's happening." Bitcoin. Harold had never mentioned Bitcoin to me, but apparently, a significant portion of our wealth had been converted to cryptocurrency, something I knew nothing about. The dollar amounts in those emails made my head spin. We had been wealthier than I ever imagined, and somehow I had been completely cut out of knowing about our own assets. The betrayal hit me like stepping into an ice-cold shower. I stood in Harold's study, hands trembling so violently I could barely hold the tablet. I walked to my kitchen on unsteady legs, hands shaking as I tried to make tea, and the china cup, the one Harold had given me for our 20th anniversary, slipped through my fingers. It shattered on the linoleum floor, jagged white pieces scattering like my broken trust. Tears flowed silently down my cheeks. No one was there to comfort me. No one was there at all. For the first time in my entire adult life, I thought the words that terrified me. No more. But the fear of being completely alone snarled inside my chest like a trapped animal. Could I survive without them? Could I dare to say no to the only family I had left? I spent that night sitting on my living room floor, carefully picking up every piece of that broken cup. Each fragment felt like a memory, a moment of love now destroyed. I packed away Harold's photographs, especially the ones where he smiled at me with genuine joy before Sandra entered our lives. I stared into the cracked mirror in my bathroom and barely recognized the woman looking back. Who had I become? A ghost, haunting her own life in the city she once called home. The next morning, Sandra called. Her voice was honey-sweet, but I could hear the steel underneath. "Helen, we need to talk about Harold's accounts. There are some papers you need to sign." My heart hammered against my ribs. "What kind of papers?" "Just standard estate stuff. Michael will explain everything when he comes over this afternoon." But I had seen those emails. I knew what this was really about. When Michael arrived, he had a leather folder full of documents I didn't understand. Legal language that might as well have been written in a foreign tongue. He spoke quickly, pointing at signature lines, avoiding eye contact. "This just transfers some assets to make tax planning easier," he said, but his voice sounded hollow. Dad would have wanted this. I stared at my son, this man I had raised, nursed through fevers, cheered at high school graduation. His eyes couldn't meet mine. "I need time to think about this," I said quietly. His jaw tightened. "Mom, these things need to be handled quickly. The market is volatile right now. Every day we wait costs money. Money. It always came back to money. When I refused to sign that day, the temperature in the room seemed to drop 20 degrees. Michael's face hardened in a way I had never seen before. "Mom, you're not thinking clearly. This is what's best for everyone." "Everyone?" I asked. "Or everyone except me?" The confrontation that followed was unlike anything in our family's history. Michael denied everything with the fierce desperation of someone caught in an obvious lie. "Mom, you're imagining things. We love you. We're trying to help you." Sandra's smile was sharper than broken glass. "You're tired, Helen. Maybe a little confused. Grief does that to people." David, when he finally arrived, looked anywhere but at me. Guilt flickered across his face like candlelight in a draft. When I showed them the emails I had found, Sandra's mask slipped for just a moment. Pure rage flashed in her eyes before she composed herself. "Those emails are taken completely out of context," she said smoothly. "We were just concerned about your financial security." The emotional blackmail came swiftly after that. "We're a family," Michael said, his voice breaking with fake emotion. "Don't tear us apart over money. Dad wouldn't have wanted this." I felt the crushing weight behind their words. But something had changed in me. Maybe it was finding those emails. Maybe it was the broken cup. Maybe it was simply that I had nothing left to lose. But for the first time in decades, I hesitated before giving in. I was trapped between my lifelong fear of abandonment and a new, growing need for self-respect. That's when Mrs. Rosa Alvarez knocked on my door. My neighbor from the floor below had noticed I seemed different lately. Her English was heavily accented, but her kindness needed no translation. She began stopping by with fresh bread still warm from the bakery on Broadway, and time she didn't have but gave anyway. "You deserve better, Helen," she said gently one afternoon, the rich aroma of her Cuban coffee filling my lonely apartment with something that felt almost like home. Rose's presence was a small flame of warmth in the frozen landscape my life had become. She listened without judging, nodded without trying to fix everything, and stayed without wanting anything in return. "In Cuba, we have saying," she told me over coffee and tres leches cake. "La familia que no respeta no es familia." Family that doesn't respect isn't family. Her dark eyes held wisdom earned through her own struggles. She had fled Cuba with nothing and built a life in New York through sheer determination. If anyone understood survival, it was Rosa. The turning point came on a rain-soaked Tuesday in September. The city was gray and cold, matching my mood perfectly. Sandra called demanding another wire transfer. Her voice was venomous when I didn't immediately agree. "What's wrong with you lately?" she snapped. "Harold barely cold in the ground, and you're acting like we're strangers." For the first time in my life, I stayed silent instead of apologizing. "Helen? Are you there?" I was there, but I wasn't the same woman who had been answering these calls for years. I hung up the phone without saying a word. My hands shook as I locked my mailbox, something I had never done before. I held back my hand when the phone rang again and again that evening. The next morning, I walked to the legal aid office on West 145th Street that Rosa had told me about. My steps were unsteady, but they were forward. I took out brochures about elder law attorneys, estate planning, financial protection, things I had never dared to learn about because Harold had always handled everything. The Spanish-speaking receptionist found a volunteer who explained my rights in simple English. That night, I slept with a calm that had abandoned me somewhere in the chaos of the past few years. The television buzzed softly in the background as rain drummed against my windows, but for once, my mind was quiet. I had booked an appointment with a lawyer for the following week. Small steps, but firm ones, toward reclaiming a life I had forgotten I deserved. The possibility of real freedom, though painful and terrifying, glittered faintly against the bleak Manhattan skyline outside my window. Maybe, just maybe, I could find out who Helen Rodriguez really was underneath decades of being someone's mother, someone's wife, someone's convenient source of funds. The lawyer's office smelled like leather and old books. Margaret Chen was younger than I expected, but her confidence was reassuring. She explained that Harold's estate was more complex than I had realized. The cryptocurrency investments were substantial, enough to set me up comfortably for the rest of my life. But they were also largely inaccessible without proper documentation that had mysteriously disappeared from Harold's files at home. "Mrs. Rodriguez," Margaret said carefully, "it appears that significant assets have been transferred without your knowledge or consent. This could constitute financial elder abuse." The words hit me like a physical blow. Elder abuse. Was that what this was? Had my own children been abusing me? Margaret helped me understand that I had rights, options, and most importantly, the law on my side. We began the process of freezing accounts, tracking transfers, and documenting everything. It was slow work, but each step felt like reclaiming a piece of myself. Months passed in a blur of legal documents, tense phone calls, and an icy wall of silence from my sons. Michael and David hired their own attorney, claiming I was mentally incompetent to manage my own affairs. The irony wasn't lost on me. The woman they had relied on for financial support for decades was suddenly too confused to handle money. The family meeting happened on a bitter February evening in Michael's living room in Queens, the same living room where I had watched my grandchildren take their first steps, opened Christmas presents, celebrated birthdays. Now it felt like a courtroom. I brought something with me that night, a photograph of Harold and me from our wedding day, young and radiant and full of dreams. I held it up for everyone to see. Michael, Sandra, David, Jennifer, even my teenage grandchildren who looked embarrassed to be there. "This is who we used to be," I said quietly, before money became more important than love. Then, in one swift motion, I tore the photograph in half. The room went dead silent. You could have heard dust settling on the furniture. "Mom!" David gasped, but I held up my hand. I had brought Harold's legal documents with me, the ones Margaret and I had been working with. I locked them away in my purse, symbolically but clearly. "I am no longer the woman who gives money and asks for nothing in return," I announced. "I am no longer the mother who accepts disrespect out of fear of losing you." Sandra's composure finally cracked completely. "You don't understand what you're doing," she hissed, her voice rising. "You're destroying this family over greed." But I stood tall for the first time in years, my voice steady and sure. "I will no longer buy love. Respect me or lose me." The silence that followed wasn't defeat. It was the clearing of space for something new to grow. Michael tried to argue, Sandra tried to manipulate, David tried to play peacemaker, but I was finished being managed, handled, or convinced against my own interests. I walked out of that house and never went back. Just when I thought the worst was behind me, life delivered one final test. A registered letter arrived at my apartment on a Thursday morning in April. Inside was a formal complaint filed with Adult Protective Services, claiming that I was suffering from dementia and was being taken advantage of by predatory legal counsel. My own children had reported me as mentally incompetent and potentially being scammed. The lies were breathtaking in their scope. According to the complaint, I had been giving money to suspicious individuals and making irrational financial decisions. They painted a picture of a confused elderly woman being exploited by strangers when the truth was exactly the opposite. But this time, the pain didn't break me. I had documentation, legal representation, and most importantly, I had found my voice. My face held a calm strength that surprised even me. I refused to respond in anger or despair. I let Margaret handle the legal response while I focused on living my life. This moment sealed my transformation completely. I was no longer the woman who dropped broken cups and cried alone in her kitchen. I was a woman who chose peace over chaos, dignity over family drama, truth over comfortable lies. The Adult Protective Services investigation was closed within 2 weeks. The caseworker noted that I was clearly competent, well represented, and making informed decisions about my own life. Spring arrived in New York like a gentle revolution. I started walking in Central Park every morning, something Harold and I used to do when we were first married, but had stopped somewhere along the way. The April air carried new scents: cherry blossoms from the reservoir, fresh bagels from street vendors, the green smell of grass emerging from winter's grip. I joined a watercolor class at the Bloomingdale Aging in Place Center on West 104th Street. My first paintings were terrible. Shaky lines, muddy colors, proportions all wrong. But they were mine. I painted skies that seemed to stretch beyond my pain, flowers that bloomed despite the darkness, city scenes full of life and movement and hope. Rosa and I became genuine friends, not just neighbors. We shared stories over coffee, laughed at telenovelas, compared notes on our grown children's various shortcomings. Her presence filled spaces in my life I hadn't realized were empty. We took the subway to Coney Island one summer weekend and ate cotton candy while watching the waves. 2 women in our 70s acting like teenagers and not caring who stared. My apartment slowly transformed. I bought new curtains in soft yellow instead of the brown ones that had hung there for 15 years. Fresh flowers appeared on my dining table. Daisies mostly, because they were cheerful and reminded me of my grandmother's garden in Puerto Rico. I wore a red dress I had bought years ago, but never had the courage to take the tags off. The fabric felt smooth and alive against my skin. Gradually, I was becoming someone again. Not Harold's wife, not Michael and David's mother, not Sandra's convenient bank account. Just Helen, a woman worthy of love and kindness and respect. Every breath I took felt like a quiet rebellion against the person I had been trained to be. My investments, properly managed now, provided more than enough income for my simple needs. I donated to causes I cared about: literacy programs, women's shelters, immigration services. I helped Rosa's nephew pay for community college. I sponsored an elderly dog at the animal shelter on the Upper West Side. Money became a tool for joy instead of a weapon for manipulation. The phone stopped ringing as much. Michael and David made a few half-hearted attempts at reconciliation, but only when they needed something. Sandra sent a cold Christmas card with no return address. My grandchildren, now in college, occasionally liked my posts on social media, but never commented or called. It hurt, but it was a clean hurt, like removing a splinter that had been festering for years. 6 months after that final family confrontation, I stand by my living room window as sunset paints the Manhattan skyline in shades of rose and gold. The city remains as loud and chaotic as ever, but inside me, a deep calm has settled like snow covering old wounds. The memories that once tangled around my heart like thorns now behave like autumn leaves, falling away naturally, making room for new growth. I've learned that love purchased with fear, obligation, and financial support isn't love at all. It's a transaction dressed up in family clothing. I sleep deeply now. I wake up peacefully. I choose how to spend my days based on what brings me joy, not what someone else needs from me. Rosa and I are planning a trip to Miami in the spring to visit her daughter. I'm taking advanced watercolor classes and learning about color theory. I volunteer at the local library reading to children whose parents work late shifts. Sometimes people ask me if I miss my family. The honest answer is that I miss the family I thought I had, but I don't miss the family I actually had. There's a difference between loving someone and being used by someone, even when that someone shares your DNA. Would I change anything if I could go back? I would have stood up for myself sooner. I would have asked harder questions about Harold's investments. I would have said no more often and felt less guilty about it. But I can't change the past, only learn from it. What I've discovered is that respect is not negotiable. Love that comes with conditions isn't love. Family that treats you like an ATM with emotions isn't family. And it's never too late to choose yourself, even when choosing yourself feels like the scariest thing you've ever done. The woman I am now would be unrecognizable to the woman I was 3 years ago. That woman was afraid of being alone, so afraid that she accepted being treated terribly rather than risk abandonment. This woman knows that being alone and being lonely are two different things. This woman has boundaries. This woman says no. This woman sleeps peacefully at night because her conscience is clear. I still love my sons. I probably always will. But I love myself too now, and that changes everything. The city lights twinkle below me as I finish my evening tea. Tomorrow, Rosa and I are going to the Metropolitan Museum. Next week, I start a cooking class focused on healthy meals for one, because cooking for yourself is an act of love, not defeat. Next month, I'm going to a Broadway show by myself because I want to see Hamilton and I don't need anyone's permission or company to enjoy it. My phone sits silent on the kitchen counter. I don't wait for it to ring anymore. I don't check it obsessively hoping for messages that never come or arrive, only when money is needed. The silence is peaceful now, instead of oppressive. As the weeks turned into months after my final confrontation with the family, I began to notice things I had never paid attention to before. The way morning light filtered through my new yellow curtains, creating patterns on the hardwood floor that reminded me of dancing. The sound of Mrs. Peterson next door practicing piano every Tuesday evening. Chopin mostly, played with the careful precision of someone who learned late in life, but with genuine passion. The smell of Rosa's Café Cubano drifting up from the floor below, rich and welcoming like a warm embrace. These small moments began to fill the spaces where anxiety and dread used to live. Where I once felt hollow, I now felt present. Actually present in my own life for the first time in decades. The watercolor classes became more than just a hobby. Maria Santos, our instructor, was a woman in her 60s who had immigrated from El Salvador in the 1980s. She had raised 5 children while working night shifts as a hospital cleaner. and only started painting when her youngest left for college. Her story resonated with something deep in my chest, the recognition of dreams deferred but not destroyed. "Art is not about perfection, senoras," she would say in her gentle voice, moving between our easels with the grace of someone who had found peace with herself. "Art is about truth. Paint your truth, not what you think others want to see." I painted my truth in blues and grays at first. Stormy skies over Central Park, rain-soaked streets, the view from my apartment window on those endless winter days when Harold was sick. But gradually, warmer colors began to appear. Yellow daisies bloying Rosa's garden, the golden hour light that painted the Hudson River each evening, children playing in the playground at Riverside Park, their laughter captured in quick, joyful brushstrokes. My paintings weren't museum quality, but they were mine. They told the story of a woman discovering that life wasn't over at 73. It was just beginning to be authentic. One afternoon in late October, while cleaning out more of Harold's belongings, I found something that stopped me cold. Hidden in his desk drawer, underneath old insurance papers and expired warranties, was a letter addressed to me. The envelope was yellowed at the edges, and the handwriting was unmistakably his, but shakier than I remembered. It was dated just 2 weeks before he died. My hands trembled as I opened it, half afraid of what I might find inside. Did he know about the Bitcoin transfers? Had he been part of Sandra and Michael's plan all along? The possibility terrified me more than being alone ever could. "My dearest Helen," the letter began, and already tears were blurring my vision. "If you're reading this, I'm gone, and you've probably discovered things about our finances that I should have told you while I was still here. I was a coward, mi amor. A weak, sick, frightened old man who let our sons and that woman manipulate me when I should have protected you." I sat down hard on his old desk chair, the leather creaking under my weight. Harold's presence filled the room so completely I could almost smell his aftershave. "I know about the Bitcoin accounts. I know about the transfers. Sandra convinced me it was for tax planning, and Michael said you wouldn't understand the technology. They made me feel like keeping it from you was protecting you from stress and confusion. I see now that I was protecting no one but my own guilt." The words on the page began to blur through my tears, but I forced myself to keep reading. By the time I realized what was really happening, I was too weak to fight them. The cancer had spread to my bones, Helen. I could barely think straight most days from the pain medication. But I wasn't too weak to write down every password, every account number, every piece of evidence you'll need to get back what's yours. My heart hammered against my ribs as I read on. Harold had documented everything, hidden away in a safe deposit box at Chase Manhattan, the key taped under the false bottom of his jewelry box. He had been gathering evidence for months before he died, preparing to ensure I wouldn't be completely defenseless. "You were always stronger than you knew, mi corazon. Stronger than I ever gave you credit for. I should have encouraged you to handle our money from the beginning, instead of making you depend on me. I should have seen what Sandra was doing to our family years ago instead of dismissing your concerns as women's drama. I should have protected you instead of protecting my own peace of mind." The next paragraph made me sob out loud, alone in that quiet apartment where no one could hear me grieve. "I hope you find the courage to fight them, Helen. I hope you discover how magnificent you are when you're not busy taking care of everyone else. I hope you travel to all those places we talked about but never visited. I hope you paint those pictures you dreamed about when we were young. I hope you dance again. Remember how we used to dance in the kitchen on Sunday mornings? I hope you forgive this foolish old man who loved you more than life but didn't always know how to show it." The letter continued for 3 more pages, filled with apologies, admissions, and most surprisingly, detailed instructions for accessing not just the Bitcoin accounts, but also several traditional investment accounts that Sandra and Michael didn't know existed. Harold had been more careful with our money than even I had realized, and much smarter about protecting some of it from their schemes. The account numbers are in the safe deposit box, along with my will. The real will, not the fake one Michael had me sign when I was too drugged to read it properly. Margaret Chen handled the real will. I chose her because she came recommended as someone who specializes in protecting elderly clients from family fraud. Yes, Helen, I knew what this was called. I just didn't have the strength to call it by its name while I was alive. The final paragraph broke my heart and mended it at the same time. Live, mi amor. Live the life you deserve. Dance in the kitchen. Paint terrible pictures that make you happy. Spend our money on things that bring you joy instead of buying love from people who should love you freely. And remember, what we had was real, even if I wasn't strong enough at the end to protect it the way I should have. You are the love of my life, Helen Rodriguez, and you deserve to be someone's treasure, not someone's burden. Start by being your own. I cried until my ribs ached, clutching that letter like a lifeline. Harold hadn't betrayed me. He had been weak, confused, and manipulated, but he hadn't stopped loving me. He had tried, in his own failing way, to leave me the tools I needed to fight back. The key was exactly where he said it would be. The safe deposit box contained everything he had promised: account numbers, passwords, documented evidence of transfers, and most importantly, his real will, which left me everything except small educational funds for the grandchildren. No mention of Sandra, no additional provisions for Michael and David beyond what they had already received over the years. When I showed Margaret all of Harold's evidence, her expression shifted from professional sympathy to fierce determination. Mrs. Rodriguez, with this documentation, we can recover almost everything they took, and we can file criminal charges if you want to pursue that route. Criminal charges. Against my own sons. The thought made me nauseous, but also strangely empowered. For the first time in my life, I had a choice. I could pursue justice, or I could pursue peace. I could fight for every penny, or I could take what I could recover easily and walk away completely. It took me 3 sleepless nights to decide. I chose peace, but peace with teeth. We recovered approximately 80% of the misappropriated funds without filing criminal charges, in exchange for signed agreements that Michael and David would never contact me again unless I initiated the communication. Sandra was required to return jewelry she had borrowed over the years, including my mother's engagement ring that I thought had been lost. The legal victory felt hollow at first. I had won the battle for my financial security, but I had lost my sons in the process. Or perhaps more accurately, I had finally acknowledged that I had lost them years ago to Sandra's influence and their own greed. The legal proceedings had simply made the loss official, but as weeks passed, the hollowness filled with something unexpected. Relief. The phone didn't ring with demands disguised as crises. No one showed up at my door with urgent sob stories requiring immediate financial intervention. No one treated me like a malfunctioning ATM that needed to be manipulated into dispensing cash. For the first time in decades, my relationship with money became simple and healthy. I spent what I needed for comfortable living, saved what I wanted for security, and gave away what brought me joy to causes and people I believed in. Money became a tool for creating the life I wanted, instead of a weapon others used against my desire to be loved. Winter in New York took on a different character that year. Instead of dreading the cold, dark months trapped in a small apartment with nothing but memories and regrets for company, I found myself embracing the season. I bought warm, colorful clothes instead of the drab, practical garments I had worn for years. I invested in good boots, a soft cashmere scarf in bright purple, and a wool coat that made me feel elegant instead of invisible. Rosa and I developed traditions. Thursday afternoon coffee and gossip sessions in my kitchen. Sunday morning walks around the reservoir in Central Park, rain or shine. Evening telenovela viewing parties with homemade popcorn and commentary in 2 languages. Her friendship became the foundation for rebuilding my social life from scratch. Through Rosa, I met other women in the building and neighborhood who had stories similar to mine. Carmen on the 5th floor, whose daughter only called when her husband was out of work. Mrs. Liu from 8B, whose son had power of attorney, and kept her on such a tight budget she couldn't afford the good tea she loved. Janet from the grocery store, whose grandchildren were taught to ask Grandma for money every time they visited. We formed an informal support group, meeting for coffee once a week in the community room of our building. We called ourselves Las Mujeres Fuertes, the strong women. We shared stories, advice, and most importantly, the understanding that choosing yourself doesn't make you selfish. It makes you survivors. These women became my family of choice. We celebrated each other's birthdays with homemade cakes and heartfelt gifts. We supported each other through medical appointments and legal battles. We traveled together on day trips to museums, botanical gardens, and art galleries. We created the loving, respectful family dynamic that I had craved for so many years. My watercolor skills improved steadily. By spring, I was painting detailed cityscapes that captured not just the visual beauty of New York, but the emotional resonance of a city that had first broken my heart and then helped me rebuild it. Maria encouraged me to enter a few pieces in a local art show for seniors, and to my amazement, 2 of them sold. The buyers were a young couple who had recently moved to the Upper West Side. They loved my painting of the subway musicians at the 72nd Street station, the one where I had captured the joy on people's faces as they dropped coins in the guitar case. They hung it in their apartment entryway, where it would greet them with color and life every time they came home. Selling those paintings gave me a sense of accomplishment I hadn't felt in decades. Someone valued my creativity enough to pay money for it. Someone wanted to live with something I had created. At 74 years old, I was earning money from my art. Not much, but enough to prove that I still had something valuable to contribute to the world beyond my bank account. The young couple, Emma and James, became unexpected friends. They were both musicians struggling to make it in New York, and they reminded me of Harold and myself when we were young and hopeful, and believed anything was possible. I started commissioning them to play small house concerts for Las Mujeres Fuertes, paying them fairly for bringing live music into our lives. These evenings became magical. 8 or 10 mature women gathered in my small apartment, listening to jazz and folk songs while sipping wine and sharing appetizers we had made together. We sang along when we knew the words, clapped enthusiastically for every performance, and created the kind of intergenerational friendship that had been missing from my life for so long. During one of these concerts, Emma asked me about my family. She had noticed that I never mentioned children or grandchildren, unlike the other women who regularly shared stories and photos. I found myself telling her the truth, not the sanitized version I usually offered to new acquaintances, but the real story of manipulation, financial abuse, and choosing to save myself. "You're so brave," she said quietly, her dark eyes filled with admiration. "I can't imagine having the courage to walk away from my family, no matter how badly they treated me." Her words surprised me. I had never thought of myself as brave. Desperate, yes. Driven to survival, certainly. But brave? The word felt foreign, like putting on clothes that didn't quite fit. But in the months that followed, I began to see myself through Emma's eyes, and through the eyes of Las Mujeres Fuertes, and Rosa, and Margaret, and Maria, and all the other people who had entered my life after I chose to value myself. They saw a woman who had walked away from lifelong patterns of abuse and manipulation. They saw someone who had rebuilt her life from scratch in her 70s. They saw courage where I had only seen necessity. Slowly, very slowly, I began to believe them. The second winter after Harold's death was entirely different from the first. Instead of grieving and raging and drowning in loneliness, I was busy with art classes, friend gatherings, volunteer work, and small adventures around the city. I had season tickets to the Metropolitan Opera, something Harold and I had always talked about but never done. I took cooking classes specifically designed for one person, learning to create delicious, healthy meals for myself with the same care I had once lavished on ungrateful family members. I joined a book club at the library where we read contemporary fiction by women authors from around the world. I discovered voices and stories I never would have encountered in my previous life of caring for everyone else. I traveled to museums in Brooklyn and Queens, taking the subway alone like the independent city woman I was becoming. I even signed up for beginner Spanish classes, something I had wanted to do for years but had never had the time or mental space to pursue. My world expanded in ways I couldn't have imagined during those dark days after Harold's funeral. Each new experience, each new friendship, each small adventure proved to me that life at 74 could be richer and more fulfilling than life at 54 or even 34 had been. I wasn't just surviving, I was thriving. The most profound change was in my relationship with solitude. Where I had once feared being alone, I now treasured it. My apartment became a sanctuary instead of a prison. Quiet evenings with tea and a good book felt luxurious rather than lonely. Having no one to answer to except myself was freedom, not abandonment. I could eat dinner at 10 p.m. if I wanted. I could listen to salsa music at breakfast and jazz at midnight. I could spend an entire Saturday in my pajamas painting terrible abstract experiments that no one would ever see. I could buy expensive flowers for my dining table without having to justify the expense to anyone. I could turn my phone off for hours at a time and know that the world wouldn't end because I wasn't available to solve someone else's crisis. This was the life Harold had hoped I would find. This was the gift he had tried to give me with that letter, and the evidence he had so carefully preserved. Not just financial security, but emotional freedom. Not just survival, but the chance to discover who Helen Rodriguez really was when she wasn't busy being who everyone else needed her to be. One evening in early spring, as I was watering the small herb garden I had started on my fire escape, I realized that I had stopped thinking about Michael and David every day. I still loved them. That ache in my chest probably would never completely disappear, but they no longer dominated my thoughts and emotions. They had become part of my past instead of the defining force of my present. If you've ever lived through something like this, you know how isolating it feels. You know the confusion of loving people who seem to see you only as a resource. You know the guilt that comes with setting boundaries with family members. You know how hard it is to choose your own well-being when you've been trained to sacrifice it for others. Maybe you're listening to this story and recognizing pieces of your own life. Maybe your children only call when they need something. Maybe your relatives treat you like a bank account with legs. Maybe you've been giving and giving until there's nothing left of who you used to be. If any of this sounds familiar, I want you to know something important. You deserve better. You deserve respect. You deserve love that doesn't come with a price tag. You deserve family members who value your presence, not just your presence. And you deserve to choose yourself, even when choosing yourself feels impossible. The path isn't easy. There will be guilt, fear, loneliness, and doubt. There will be people who try to convince you that you're being selfish or unreasonable. There will be moments when you wonder if you've made a terrible mistake. But on the other side of that fear is freedom. On the other side of that guilt is peace. On the other side of that loneliness is the possibility of real relationships built on mutual respect instead of financial dependency. You are not too old to start over. You are not too old to say no. You are not too old to demand better treatment from the people who claim to love you. And you are definitely not too old to discover who you really are when you're not busy being who everyone else needs you to be. Take it from someone who spent 73 years learning this lesson the hard way. It's better to be alone and respected than surrounded and used. It's better to have one genuine friend like Rosa than a dozen family members who only call when they need something. It's better to live authentically in a small apartment than to live as a ghost in a mansion of other people's expectations. The sun has set completely now, and Manhattan glitters like scattered diamonds against black velvet. Somewhere in Queens, Sandra is probably planning her next move, figuring out how to access whatever assets she thinks I still control. Somewhere in Brooklyn, Michael is probably telling his friends what an unreasonable mother he has. Somewhere in New Jersey, David is probably feeling guilty, but not quite guilty enough to pick up the phone and apologize. And here in my small apartment on the Upper West Side, Helen Rodriguez is finally, truly, at peace. Have you ever felt invisible in your own family? Have you ever wondered if your loved ones see you as a person or as a provider? Have you ever felt guilty for wanting to be treated with basic respect by your own children? I'd love to hear your story in the comments below. Sometimes knowing we're not alone in these experiences is the first step toward healing. If this story touched something in your heart, if it reminded you of your own struggles or gave you hope for your own future, please give this video a like and subscribe to this channel. Your support helps me continue sharing these honest, difficult truths. And maybe, just maybe, my story will reach someone who needs to hear that they're not crazy, they're not selfish, and they deserve so much better than what they're accepting. Thank you for listening to my heart. Thank you for letting me share the hardest chapter of my life. And thank you for reminding me that even our darkest stories can become sources of light for others walking similar paths. Until next time, remember, you are worth more than what you can give. You are worth more than what you can provide. You are worth love, respect, and kindness. simply because you exist. And sometimes, the most courageous thing you can do is believe that about yourself.